When my dad sat in hospital with a stoma bag, a feeding tube and a catheter, like every bodily function happening outside his body, I remember him shrugging his shoulders and saying, well, there's no point crying over spilt milk. You know, I was like, oh, I probably would be crying about that glass of milk that you just spilt over, Dad, if that was me. He would want people to know. He would want what happened to him to mean something and to matter and to help just one other person and one other family. That's all he would have wanted. It is impossible to articulate how important the smallest of kind gestures can be. The time taken to know how Dad liked his Earl Grey tea, ensuring that he had a haircut and a shave regularly, the relaxing of strict visiting times to accommodate family travelling long distances, the ward secretary, Shirani, who always greeted you with a name and a smile. Families and patients need continuity. Every time Dad was in hospital, he started to rely on really small daily routines that gave him some sort of sense of normal. Times of medication, meal times, visiting times, and they changed at every single hospital he went to. And it's normal that things change, but it is really, really debilitating for a patient who is trying so hard to take on board information given to them, to accept all the new routines that are put in place, and to take responsibility for their own progress as a patient. And to receive such continually conflicting information and trying to see my dad cope with that daily was the most heartbreaking thing. I remember a time when I received a phone call from Dad. He had been transferred to a new ward in the hospital he was in, and he'd been left in a boiling hot room for hours. So he had called me to tell me that he was boiling hot and needed some water. And I had to phone the nurses station and ask them to go into the room and make sure my dad had some water. It was just heartbreaking to try and keep on top of that and try and not show him how anxious and worried and terrified you were. And continuity relies on communication, good communication. When Dad was transferred back to hospital from a rehabilitation centre, his glasses were left behind, along with all his medication. To rush somebody in the middle of the night to a hospital half an hour away with an infection, with no glasses and no essential medication and no properly written notes, and then when the family are informed, they have to go back and get that stuff, and when they arrive, all your father's clothes, a huge fridge with all his stuff that he had to take because he was fed through a tube, are thrown into carrier bags and left in a corner of a room, and a nurse says to you, when are you taking the fridge? It makes you feel that nobody has this under control and nobody cares as much as you do. You know they're busy and they're tired and they're stressed, and you spend a lot of time saying, I'm really sorry, but I'm so sorry, I know you're busy, but would you mind? And you're apologising for the failings in their system, which are not getting you, perhaps, what you need. You're running between teams, trying to find the right information, and everyone tells you different things. We were told that my dad was dying in a stock cupboard, and we were told that they would take his feeding line out because it was causing massive infections, that he'd had all the antibiotics they could give him, that he was on a DNR, and that he would die of starvation if an infection didn't get him first. And they told me that in a stock cupboard. Even though it's second nature to you, it's the first time they've heard it. And it's often frightening, and it's often confusing. And they need to absorb it, think about it, and figure out what they need to ask about it. Give them time to articulate their questions and to absorb what you're telling them. The first time we went to see Field's house, Lucy and her head nurse, Margaret, were greeted with two women who basically couldn't keep it together and must have got through a box of tissues in about 30 seconds. Armed with a ridiculous list of questions from, do you have syringe drivers, do you have Earl Grey tea? And they basically sat us down and gave us tissues and tea and cake and talked. But most importantly, actually listened. When Lucy came to talk to Dad at the hospital, and she sat with Dad for about 45 minutes, and she asked him all about himself and his life, all the stuff he was involved in, and she just listened to him. And I just saw somebody that cared. And there was something very early on that Margaret, the head nurse there, said to both me and my sister. She said, we're not only here to take care of your dad, but we're here to take care of you. And they made me feel, they made all of us feel secure so that I could just spend time with my dad. I didn't really know my dad, not as a man, before he got sick. I knew him as a dad, and everybody that took care for him when he was sick allowed him to continue to be my dad and allowed us to continue to learn from him. One day I got a phone call from Sally and said to me, are you in your car? And I said yes, and she said, okay, you need to get here and you need to phone your family. He's probably got about 24 hours at most. And I'd asked her to be very blunt with me and not mess about with words. And she was, but in a way that was completely supportive. And I understood, we all understood what we had to do. We all went over to the home. We were given a room, separate to Dad's room, with tea and cake, of course, as always. And we were allowed to totally come and go as we needed to, for as long as we needed to. And various members of the family arrived throughout the night. Nurses would come in and out and talk to us and talk to Dad, even though he couldn't answer. And that made a massive difference. They still talked to him, and they engaged with all of us as if this was the most natural thing in the world. And it was weirdly so un-death-like and so un-somber. You know, we would be joking and talking and laughing. And even though Dad couldn't speak, it was like we were all, you know, sharing something that is natural, something that should be natural. My dad taught me how to die, but during his illness, he also taught me how to live.